Our next panel is Fatigue and Aviation Challenge. We'll explore the science behind fatigue, its effects, and practical strategies to address it. Please welcome our panelists, moderator and AAT analyst for NATCA, Don Johnson, director and professor of sleep specializing in circadian disorders, Dr. Chuck Czeisler, director of Fatigue Countermeasures Laboratory, NASA Ames Research Center, Dr. Erin Flynn-Evans, former board member NTSB and former director Fatigue Countermeasures Program, NASA Ames Research Center, Dr. Mark Rosekind, FAA's Human Performance Team Manager, Stephanie Kreseen, and NACA's Human Performance Representative, Erin Katz.
So fatigue is a major concern in the aviation industry amongst pilots and controllers, and is currently the latest hot topic. Now, as the aviation industry continues to evolve, understanding and addressing fatigue becomes more and more important to keep it to the highest standards for safety and efficiency, not only at work, but also in our personal lives. Now, I wanted to start with our scientists up here, and I want to ask you all three of you. So we have Dr. Chuck, we have Erin with the big title, and we have Mark over here. I'd like to start with you and ask each of you to provide a brief overview of your research on fatigue and why is it relevant to aviation?
Well, thanks very much for that question. My own research, there are three things over my career that are really relevant to aviation. The first was the recognition that the internal clock in the brain controls our ability to sleep, and that varies with the time of day. The second major finding was that light is the most powerful signal that resets our internal clock each day and keeps us in sync with the 24-hour day, and that exposure to light can actually help people adapt to night shift work. And the third finding that's really relevant is that recurrent disruption of our circadian rhythms not only adversely affects sleep and performance, but has real adverse health consequences as well.
Erin?
Thank you. So I work at NASA, and many people just think about spaceflight when they think about NASA. And of course, we do work with astronauts, and we do study them to determine why they may become fatigued and to develop countermeasures for them, and that certainly has an impact on aviation. But many people forget that the first A in NASA is aeronautics, and about half of the work that we do in my lab is focused on the aviation industry. I work under a program called System-Wide Safety, and we're interested in looking at fatigue really across all aspects of the aviation system to make sure that travelers and workers in this environment get where they need to be safely.
Thank you. Mark?
So first, actually, I get to talk on behalf of my colleagues. So Chuck and Erin allowed me to basically say thank you to NATCA, because the work we did on the report would not have been possible without all of you folks educating us on what your job is. And so Rich and Dean and Erin and so many people out there were just invaluable to us. So it's really great to have a public opportunity just to say thank you, everybody, for your help. So we actually got to know what you really do in the trenches. I would just say over my 30-year career, one of the studies I'm kind of most known for is when I was at NASA running the Fatigue Countermeasures program, we did a project giving pilots a planned rest period on the flight deck. And they slept for 26 minutes, and that improved performance by 34% and alertness by 54% using objective measures. So a nap, a NASA nap, is a very strong, powerful strategy. And I'll just say we repeated that at the Stanford Emergency Department with docs and nurses, pretty much got the same thing. Let me just say last thing. You started it, Dawn, and that is so much when we talk about fatigue is about on-the-job safety, health, but we really care that people get home safely. And that's another part that we are really interested to make sure comes out in all the work that gets done here.
You mentioned nap, and I would like to come back to that, but you also mentioned circadian rhythm. And I've done, and most of the controllers in here have sat down at our CBIs, which are computer-based instructions, and have clicked through the circadian rhythm instructions. How does circadian rhythm specifically influence fatigue levels in aviation professionals, basically? And what are the key psychological mechanisms involved in that?
Well, before we can talk about the impact of circadian rhythms on performance, we have to talk about sleep. Erin?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about sleep because sleep is actually distinct from circadian rhythms. They're interrelated, and of course, we care about both of them as they contribute to fatigue. But sleep is fundamental to our health, well-being, and performance. We do need 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night in order to be at our best. And when we don't get that 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night, a chronic sleep debt accumulates. And one of the consequences of this, of course, is performance decrements, but I would say the bigger consequence is that we don't recognize when we're performing poorly. So we feel like we're adapting, we feel like we're getting by okay, but the reality is we're not. And there are health consequences too. So just a week of 5 hours sleep per night leads to healthy people looking like they're pre-diabetic. So the consequences of short sleep are quite substantial. And it play into circadian rhythms.
Right, and in that example, for the men, testosterone levels decline by about an equivalent of 11 years of aging with just a week of sleeping 4 to 5 hours of sleep at night. So it has effects on many different systems. The thing about the interaction, you asked about the circadian system, as I mentioned at the beginning, the ability to sleep varies with the time of day. So one of the reasons why we had recommended in our report 12 hours off before the night shift is because sleeping during the day, the internal clock sends out a strong drive for wakefulness during the day, particularly as the day wears on near the end, right before the time that you usually would go to bed at night. And that's true not just for us, but for day-active species. If you look at many different animals, if they're day-active, they start running around before it gets dark because they can't see in the dark, and they need to get to a safe place. Well, that's been baked into our genes. So if you're trying to sleep in what we call the wake maintenance zone in the evening, then the brain is waking you up. And somebody who is, let's say, 30 years old can only sleep 75% of that time, and somebody who is 50 years old can only sleep 50 to 60% of that time during the daytime, and that's why controllers have reported that they only get 2 to 4 hours of sleep when they have that time off during the daytime.
Okay. So we keep mentioning the report, so I do want to talk about the report a little bit. The three of you did participate in the research for the Assessing Fatigue Risk in the FAA Air Traffic Operations report. So let's briefly talk about the latest research findings. Critical to air traffic controllers, decision-making and reaction time is pretty much what we do day to day. What does science reveal about the impact of fatigue on cognitive function?
I think I can take that one also. I mean, there's no doubt that as controllers you have an incredibly complex job. You have to engage in focused attention, short-term memory. You have to make a plan and replan as you get new information. You have to have really solid training and a pull from your stores of long-term memory. And unfortunately, all of these aspects of cognitive function are affected by fatigue. But importantly, as Dr. Rosekind shared earlier, it's not just that on-the-job performance that is important or that we're worried about. I would argue that maybe we're more important about what happens after a busy day at work. You have that release, you come down, you're letting go of all of the stressors that you've experienced at work, getting into the car and driving home. That's where you're most vulnerable. That's the task that we're, I think, most worried about.
And Dawn, let me just add that the bottom line is, lose sleep, disrupt your clock, you will pay for it. So basically, every aspect of human capability is degraded or impaired. So when people say, what does that mean for cognitive? What does it mean for emotion? It's all degraded or impaired. That we know.
Go ahead.
And one other thing is that when you talk about new findings, what's been learned in the last decade is what a detrimental effect it has on our health to recurrently disrupt our circadian rhythms by changing schedule like you all do 3 times a week. And it is now known that increases your risk of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes. It increases the risk of inflammation, of obesity, gaining weight, and diabetes. And it also increases the risk of mood disorders, depression, anxiety disorders, and suicidal ideation. And it increases the risk of premature death. Otherwise, there's no problem.
And that is specifically talking to our schedules,
that's
right?
specifically
on the
schedules.
221.
And that's why we were so alarmed about that schedule. I mean, it is National Academy of Science reports and so on have said, how is this even possible now, given the science that's known?
Yeah. So are there specific factors such as the time of day or the shift pattern or sleep quality that significantly affect the risk, according to the studies that you guys did on controllers?
Yes, a whole bunch of them, shall we?
Well, yeah, I mean, if we were, you're talking about the 221 schedule.
Yes.
Yeah. If the 3 of us were to sit down and try to design a schedule that would be the most unhealthy and physiologically challenging, it would be hard to come up with something worse. Because it has all the elements that you would want in a bad schedule. 2 shifts in one day. You know, starting with the midnight, early day shift. Let's get them up really early so that now we have 8 or 9 hours off between the shift where you can't sleep because the internal clock is making it hard for you to sleep. And then we're going to have you come back for the midnight shift. And so you're going to stay up. So basically, you're up almost the entire 24-hour period, maybe 2 or 3 hours. I mean, I'm not telling you something you don't know.
No?
And then there's also the number before the, you know, with the late evening shift, before the day shift. And you're rotating the shifts in a counterclockwise direction of shift rotation, which we've known for 40 years is the worst way to go. So you got all the elements in one package.
We call the coming off the midnight shift hangover. Because you
Right.
just have that feeling, you know, where you can't get over it, and it's just the sleep deprivation.
And that's why I think it's called a rattler, because it bites you.
That's a good point. Very good point. Anything you want to add to that? No, not touching it, huh? I do want to come back to something you said about the shifts, but before I do that, let's talk a little bit about lighting. Because a lot of our control rooms, TRACONs, have dim lighting or lower lighting. Can you talk about the lighting with that?
Yes, well, you know, here on Earth, we live with the sun determining when we'll be awake and when we're asleep. And this isn't just a cue that kind of helps us get along. There's a direct biological effect to light on our circadian rhythm and on our alertness. Light travels through the eyes, goes into the brain, and sends an alerting signal. So when we sit under light, particularly light that mimics that sunlight that's blue enriched, we're going to feel more alert. When we sit in very dark rooms like this, especially after lunch, we are more likely to fall asleep. So you can kind of look around and see if
turn those lights on.
anybody around you is nodding off. And so that's really the core issue with lighting. At NASA, we have made huge progress and have worked with our mission controllers and controllers for different missions, like the Viper mission, going to the moon, to change the lighting to help enhance alertness and performance, and it's made a huge positive impact on those mission controllers. So it can be done, but obviously it has to be done in a thoughtful way.
Okay.
I just want to add to what Erin said, is this is a physical effect. It's not a psychological effect, oddly enough. And we can show that this happens in some totally blind people who have no conscious light perception but the novel photoreceptive system that mediates these effects are still working, even if they're totally blind.
Well, that's interesting, that your body absorbs it, and your body
Right.
is the one that
It's going,
reacts to it,
as
not
Erin said,
necessarily
it's
your
going
eyes.
through the brain. It is going through the eyes, but it is being mediated not by the rods and cones, but, if I can get technical for a moment, by intrinsically photosensitive ganglion cells that we didn't realize existed 20 years ago.
So it helps you take the science into the practical. So we know it's a rule that if you talk about sleep and fatigue, it's always after lunch, often at that 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It just seems to be a rule of conventions. But the other part, which we just talked about, is guess what? Yeah, if you raise up the light level here, that would make a difference in how alert people are, like after lunch paying attention. So all the science stuff actually has practical applications in the real world.
So I'd like to circle back a little bit for the shifts and talk a little bit about time in between shifts. I mean, I get it. We have the new 10 and 12 hours in between shifts, right? And this is kind of an elephant in the room. So I get the 10 hours between shifts, 8 hours on the shift, an hour to home, you know, to and from. I get that. But talk to us a little bit more about the 12 hours. Like, help us understand the idea behind the 12 hours.
Chuck?
Well, because the 12 hours is before and after the night shift. It's specifically in those times, because that's when you're trying to sleep during the day. That's when the internal clock in the brain is making it difficult for you to sleep. And even the youngest controller, who should be able to sleep most effectively at that time, can still only sleep about 75% of the time that they're in bed. So that means, you know, if you can't, 8 hours is not enough, or 10 hours is not enough, because you're going to be 8 hours in bed, and then you're only going to get at maximum 6 if the stars align correctly, but more likely 4 or 5.
Okay.
And it's a starting point, right? One of the most critical preventive strategies is to have sufficient sleep before you go to work. And so if you start with not having enough time to get that sleep in, you've already basically put people behind the ball, right?
So staffing obviously plays a significant role in the findings of this fatigue report. If we were to have optimal staffing, all right, best across the board, would that solve our issue, our fatigue issue?
That would make a huge difference in some of the fatigue issues. So there's no question not having enough people is already creating decrements with overtime, extended work weeks. There's no question fatigue is exacerbated because of the staffing. But we also have to realize, even if you were fully staffed, you would still have the issues we're talking about. So even if everybody was there, if they don't have enough time off to get sleep before they go on the job, if they're still working through the night, we're just biologically not programmed to be able to work through the night. So those will exist no matter what. I often joke when people say, oh, we've got, you know, a single person on the night shift and they fell asleep, let's put 2 people on the job. And I joke, if you don't actually come up with strategies to affect the fatigue, you're just going to have 2 people asleep on the job. So even at full staff, it's like you don't want all those people. You have to have strategies going to actually help them maintain their alertness, even with those biological challenges that they're facing.
And with the Rattler, there's no way you can have enough staff. I mean, you're not going to avoid fatigue on that schedule.
Yeah. So let's circle back to napping. I remember in taking the CBIs that I mentioned that, especially with the circadian rhythms, that napping is part of that helps. So based on your research, what are some of the most effective interventions and strategies for mitigating fatigue in this high stress environment?
So let me just start, because I was going to say, well, as an NTSB board member, when we investigated fatigue crashes, it was really clear that there were organizational factors and then there were individual ones. And so I think, like, I'm going to hand it over in a second here for some organizational and individual, but you have to realize this is the classic shared responsibility kind of issue. And that if the organization isn't doing its part or individuals aren't doing their part, you're going to have an issue. Opposite is when the organization acknowledges and is actually trying to address it, and individuals understand why things are being done, then you have the optimal chance to make sure people will be alert, healthy, and safe. So I don't know if you want to talk about the specifics?
Yeah, I mean, there are many specific strategies, but right now, it's an untenable situation in which the organization, as you said, is scheduling people to a schedule to which they as individuals can never do something to adapt to it because there's just, it's physiologically not possible. But once you get a good set of institutional systems in place, then individuals can do a lot of things. One of the questions is, can caffeine be used strategically? And it can. Very low doses of caffeine taken at frequent intervals instead of a big bolus at the beginning of the shift, just an ounce or two of coffee every hour actually will build up the caffeine levels as the time of the shift duration is increasing instead of having them go down if you take it at the beginning. And Erin, you were going to talk about some lighting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned lighting before. Lighting is a good solution. I would say also there have been studies in NASA mission control centers where we've put some of the lighting in break rooms. So if it's not feasible to have a lighting change in the operational area, having enhanced lighting in a break room can help. Similarly, naps, are a huge countermeasure to fatigue because you can't replace sleepiness with caffeine or lighting or any other countermeasure. Sleep is really key. But with all of these things, you have to have education because just, based on, we have a question on caffeine here that, you've just addressed. If you don't know how to use caffeine effectively, it's not going to help you at all. And so you have to have a really good education system so that each of these countermeasures can be deployed appropriately.
So can I just, for summary, organizationally, you've got schedules, the environment, policies, and education. And for individuals, you've got naps, light, activity, and breaks. Yeah. This is like an example. If there's concrete stuff that's been studied, we know will help improve fatigue.
And exercise, too.
And exercise.
Yeah.
So Stephanie, from your perspective, how do you balance the scientific recommendations that we've been hearing about with operational demands?
So I think the scientific recommendations help provide a roadmap to make sure that we're incorporating fatigue considerations when we look at things like workload management. We do workload management on a daily basis in our facilities, so now we have information to factor fatigue into that as we do it.
So Erin, as the National Human Performance Representative, I made that title as long as I could
Thank
to
you.
kind of match everybody else.
I've got title envy.
How do these scientific insights resonate with you and with what you have absorbed in the field with our?
Yeah, so probably two things. Controllers, by nature, I think, are really good at thinking outside the box. But to properly address the issues that controllers face with fatigue, we got to take the box, crush it up, break it, throw it away. Then we got to build a new box, and then we got to think outside that box. That's kind of where we're at with our fatigue risk management program right now. And thankfully, the report, as I said in our pre-meeting there, was kind of like pennies from heaven, because it shined a light on a problem that's existed for a while. And whether people are out there right now loving the changes, I heard some applause earlier about the difficulty of the schedules, or people are resistant to the change. I don't know. People, I think they must love change, right? We all love it, especially things that have been around for decades, right? I'm hearing people have discussions about schedules that are long overdue, and already you can see the controllers solving the next problem, thinking outside the box, and we will get to a place where our schedules contribute to our overall well-being instead of rob us blind from it. And the other insight I had, something that you actually said back there, Don. You said you had read the fatigue report because, your words, not mine, you're getting older, and fatigue had become more important to you.
Yep.
And a lot of our workforce, I'm envious of, it is far younger than I am. And
we are
maybe
far younger than we are.
Okay, that's fair. I was trying to take the hit on that one. Feel like fatigue is not like an everyday thing for them outside of maybe a very extended long work week and some additional challenges outside of work. But fatigue is like this thing where you open up the tab when you're young and you pay the bill when you get older. And you better hope when you get older that you got enough money to pay the bill. And not all of us will. Because even though you're young and you're bouncing back quicker, you start to feel it more when you're older. But you are adding notches to that cumulative effect that you're really, it's really going to determine kind of how you come out of this career at the end when you've got a retirement that you worked so hard for waiting for you.
And admittedly, coming into the profession, I liked the Rattler. I was young, I was do the midnight shift, come off that midnight shift, sleep for 4 hours maybe, and I had a full day ready to go. And it wasn't until, I started aging, just a little bit, that I started to feel the effects, and that's when it became, in my verbiage at home, I have the midnight shift hangover, right? So reading this fatigue report really opened my eyes, and I guess being a controller in the younger days, this was the best schedule ever, okay, the best schedule. But as you get older, it's hard to, and you're starting to see, especially, so there's a question about how it's affecting with us, all of this with 6-day work weeks. Okay, so not only do we have this particular schedule, but we're also working 6-day work weeks. So that becomes a little bit of an issue fatigue-wise. Is there anything?
So one of the things, everybody focuses on how much sleep did you have last night. But if you don't get sleep, it actually builds into what we call sleep debt. You should think about that like your bank account, because if you do that calculation, that number for everyone in this room, you are bankrupt, right? I mean, when you think about your career, and so it's, yeah, last night was really important, but that sleep debt is high on everybody. So that's the issue of the aging thing. The longer you do that, the higher the price.
So how important is it to build the foundation with work groups to address the 221 schedule and develop alternatives?
Yeah, so obviously we've kind of come in with a first round of things that we're approaching a little different. And, kind of given the nature of the timing of the release of your report and really wanting to capitalize on some of the short-term things we could work through together. But having to provide some guidance for people to build their 2025 schedules, I think it's certainly what currently exists out there is far from the end of the work. And that's why you see additional work groups being stated as part of the changes to continue to flush this thing out to where it becomes the comprehensive overhaul of our fatigue risk management program that we have to get to. We talked about naps. I know there was a question about naps for up until just recently. Napping was like a dirty word. And that's a holdover of days gone by, right? Now we need to not only just change, it's not as simple as just changing something in the point 3 to say, hey, it's good to take a nap. We have a culture out there that has to change. People should feel comfortable and safe telling their supervisor in the operation that on this break, I need to take a nap. And the supervisor should feel confident that that's a perfectly acceptable practice at this point because we want controllers providing the highest level of safety.
So for staff, what are the primary reasons for implementing all these changes at this point in time?
Yeah, so I think that, research evolves. We did something very similar back in 2011, 2012, and maybe missed some opportunities at that point to implement what we knew about fatigue then. And so we now, courtesy of the fantastic fatigue experts up here, have a lot of updated information, new information that we can help improve our fatigue risk management program and introduce some of these changes that are long overdue.
Now, this fatigue report suggested upwards of 58 changes, or 58 suggested changes. How easy or difficult is it to get us there to those changes? I mean, it's a lot of changes. What do we have to do?
Go.
I was going to, Erin and I have worked together behind the scenes to go through those 58 opportunities as a starting point, and take a look at what we might want to move out on sooner rather than later.
Yeah. And I was just going to highlight, there were 4 priority ones that were identified that have all been already at least addressed, and now we're waiting to see how your working groups actually turn them into action.
Sure, and the changes, the ownership of some of the changes don't all rest within the human performance team. There are simply things outside of our purview to work on, but because these recommendations are being taken seriously, they will be parsed out to the right people to handle them. And it's not to say that all 58 are going to be adopted, right? I mean, staffing being the big elephant in the room, it's add one more list to the thing that staffing makes it difficult to do, right? But at least now, we have something we can point to that reflects what we know about fatigue in 2024. You mentioned the 2011 stuff. I've had people ask me, like, how come this new report seems to state things that goes against what was said in 2011? Right? For the same reason that in 1950 you could find research studies that said smoking was great for you. You evolve, you mature, you learn more. Science never stops sciencing, right? And you can only go off of what you have now and make the appropriate changes.
So I feel like we could talk about this for another 15 to 20 more minutes, but I am going to have to cut it short. But before we go, I would like to ask each of you to share one key takeaway from managing the fatigue, like one key thing that we can wrap up. We'll start with you.
Well, I think that this is a once in a 40, 50-year opportunity. I mean, to have the focus of the administrator of the agency on this for the first time certainly in my lifetime is I think an opportunity that NATCA and the agency can really take advantage of. And I think that that's the major opportunity that I see.
Can I just say ditto? I don't think we can understate how incredible this opportunity is to bring all stakeholders to the table, to have these conversations. It has the potential to be hugely positively impactful.
And I would just say, you can't fool Mother Nature. So you lose sleep, you disrupt your clock, there's a very high price to pay. But we now know there are effective actions you can take to eliminate or mitigate fatigue, and that's the path that we're encouraging all of you to take.
Dr. Rosekind mentioned that, we want you to get home safe. And I would say that, yes, Erin and I want you to get home safe, and we want you to be able to be present for your families, for your life, right? And that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback right off that. It is far past time that we stop trying to support employees for the 8 or 10 hours that they show up to work and start creating things that support people in the other 16 hours they spend being human beings. And everything we do and every change we make has to incorporate that into it. If it doesn't, we're wasting our time, and it's just one more CBI, Don, like you said. That here it is, you read it, fatigue. Go ahead, make good choices. We can't put time into that anymore. We have to make changes that don't just disrupt people's lives, but account for the fact that they have lives.
Well, I want to say thank you, and let's continue. Let's continue to prioritize understanding and managing fatigue, not only at work, but in our private lives. Thank you. Thank you. That was great.